Hey folks, welcome back to another video. My name is Matt Cuda, and today we're going to be talking about the Sony A1, the flagship camera of Sony. I've been wanting to get my hands on one of these for a long time now, and finally I have one, and here it is, the Sony A1. I spent about a week testing this camera. I took it from everything from backyard bird photography to going to Middle Creek Wildlife Refuge and photographing the snow geese. And I think it's going to be a very nature-centric review, and particularly how does this camera handle birds in flight and so forth. So without further ado, let's get into just taking a look at how this camera is built. To the other Sony A7 series, A9 series, with a few exceptions. I think overall the camera build is a little thicker. If I were to compare it here with my A9 over here and the A1 here, you know, we can see that the thickness here is more. So, you know, as I look at that, the right in through here on the A1 has got some more heft. And actually, if you kind of put them together, the A1 to me seems a little bit longer as well. It's just a thicker, heavier magnesium alloy body, but it still looks like that A9. I mean, if we had them side by side here, you know, that A1 and A9, they just look like Sony cameras. There's no doubt about it. If I were to delve in here to construction differences, first on the dials, you're going to notice that the exposure compensation now can be locked by pushing this button down, and now I no longer have to worry about bumping it. Whereas with the A9 and other A7 cameras, it's so easy to just bump that switch right there. And believe me, I've done it so many times and not realized that I did it. So that's a welcome improvement. The dials are different here. It's a little different setup. I don't know if I like it any better or if it's any better or any worse. I mean, the dial is pretty much the same on the front. If we look at the Sony A9, we can see the dial is a little different. You know, I guess the A1's a little easier to move, but it's also easier to bump. So it's kind of a wash for me on that one. If we look at the dial here, which has our different shooting modes, we have basically the video mode, manual, which is what I shoot at primarily. We have shutter priority, aperture priority, and then there's two auto modes. And then we have this the camera settings of 1, 2, and 3, and that's where you can set, you know, different, like I might have 1 being my birds in flight setting, I might have 2 being landscape, and 3 being some other setting that I want to use. The camera also has the C1 button, the C2 button, the C3 button, and the C4 button. If we look at the A9, very similar, C1, C2, C3, C4, so nothing unusual there. They did change the record button here. The video record is a little bit different. I don't know if it's better or worse. The AF on button is bigger and easier to find. I don't really care. I use the AEL button for my back button focus anyway, so that's not a big deal. They have changed the joystick on the back. It has more of a, I don't know what you'd call it, kind of a more textured feel there. Frankly, I don't like it. I like the older style, like the A9 has. I think it's easier to maneuver. I don't know. I don't like either one of them, to be honest with you. I like the way Canon does their joysticks better. Although, you know, I guess overall, it's acceptable to me. The function button's the same place. The playback button's in the same place. Articulation of the screen is pretty much the same as the A9. It has the standard articulation, just like you can see over here with my A9. Now, this is a little beefier. If we look at this, the A1 is definitely beefier on the back. You can see here we have a thicker screen there. Going to the top again, on the far left top, we have high speed shooting, high plus, that's 30 frames per second. We have high, and you just go like this to change it. We have the high, that's 20 frames per second. Medium is going to be, or mid is going to be 15 frames per second. The low setting is going to be 5 frames per second. Now, when I was shooting, I found that the high setting is best. It's 20 frames per second. Guys, you just don't need 30 frames per second. I just don't. I mean, maybe you do for some reason. I mean, 20 frames is where I would keep it at personally, but that's just my opinion. It is nice to have the 30 frames if you need it. Down here on the dial, we can set, we can set the AFS button to AF single, AFC for continuous. DMF, now DMF is when you're auto-focusing, but then you want to fine-tune with manual focusing. And then manual focus is manual only. I do like that. I like it a lot. I love that dial right there. They also have it on the A9, which is where, the whole idea came from. So you've got AFC here, manual, DMF, AFS. So all welcome improvements. On the bottom, we have the battery compartment, which takes the FZ100 battery, which lasts a good day of shooting. Okay, now if we come over here, you'll notice that the battery compartment opens in a strange way. And when I say strange, I mean, unlike previous versions, you pull it down and then slide it. Now, if we compare that to another version of the camera, and here you have the button over here, and the door flips open. I like this much better. This is a much better implementation, in my opinion. This is awkward. You have to pull this down and then pull it over and then open it. It's very awkward. If we look in here, we will see that we have a CF Express A. CF Express A slot 2. You can also use SD cards in here. Why would you want to use SD cards? Well, if you don't have the $170 to spend on a CF Express A 80 gig card, that would be a good example. I think the prices are coming down a bit on the CF Express A. We'll see in the future how that plays out. The on-off switch is a little bit different here. It just has a different feel, as well as the shutter has a different feel. If I were to look at, you can see the difference here, even in the switch. I don't know if it's better or worse. It's just a little bit different. It has a little more of a slope. The A1 has a little more of a slope there. It doesn't really matter to me either way, to be honest with you. So on the other side of the camera here, we have these doors. So you can see here we've got the mic in, headphone out jack for monitoring the video recording. By the way, the doors open out. Notice how the doors open outward. On previous cameras, the doors would open and swing like this. Okay. Each one has pros and cons. The good thing about the doors that swing like the A9 is they're less apt to get broken off by hitting something. They're going to flip around like this, and it's not as big of a thing. Whereas with the A1, although I like this design better overall, I think it's easy that something could come in here and just slam into that and just knock them clean off of there. Down here we got the HDMI out. We've got the USB-C, which I love for, charging it, for moving images from one card to your computer. Down here we've got the smaller jack here, which is kind of a multi jack here. Up here we've got the PC sync cable for those people that are still using that. I don't know why you would, with all of the new advents in photography lighting. And then we have the Cat 5 type of network cable, which can be used with the A1. It can be used for both remote firing and as an output for sending to FTP sites. So essentially that's how the build quality is with this camera. It just has a better, more solid feel. I don't know if better is the right word. It has a more solid feel. You may find that that's better. I don't know, but I do think all the features are very welcome here. The feel is great. So I would say definitely a big upgrade for any kind of Sony user. Okay, let's get into the specifications. This camera retails for about $6,500. That's $5,200 used on the used market, so it's not a cheap camera. It is the flagship camera, and it has so much to offer. When we look at the processor on this, it's got dual Bionz XR processors. It's top of the line for Sony. You're talking about stacked CMOS sensor as well, which means that when I'm photographing in silent, I can shoot bursts without having distortion, without, oftentimes with other cameras that don't have that, you can get distortion in the wings of birds, golf swings, people batting like a batter in baseball and so forth. So with this, you will not get that. It has ISO from 100 to 32,000. Realistically, when I shot this camera, I never went above 6,400. I felt like that's kind of where it tapped out, in my opinion. With all those megapixels, it's definitely not as ISO friendly as, say, the 24 megapixel A9 II or A9. Having said that, having that croppability of the 50 megapixels makes this camera really, really attractive to both sports and nature photographers, particularly bird photographers who often have a difficult time getting close to their subjects. Has an articulating LCD that tilts out. That LCD is more than enough resolution at 1.44 million dots per inch, which is what we've been seeing from Sony for a long time now on their higher end cameras. The minimum shutter speed is 30 seconds and the maximum shutter speed is 132,000 when using electronic shutter, and that drops down to 1,800 when using the mechanical. The truth of the matter is, very rarely should you have to use the mechanical shutter. Some situations you may want to. For example, some people like to use it when they're doing, of course, bulb work where it's very long exposure. Some people like to use it when they are doing trigger trapping, because as far as I know, at least the last I checked, Sony, you have to use the mechanical shutter to use a trigger trap and to use remote shooting. And so you may see people gravitate toward that. The continuous drive, at high plus, you're talking 30 frames per second. At high, you're talking 20 frames per second. At mid, you're talking 15 frames per second. And then it drops down to 4 frames per second. Now, here's the thing. When I was shooting it, what did I use? Generally speaking, I used 20 frames per second, and then I dropped it down to 15 frames per second in certain situations. Honestly, and rarely would I ever use 30 frames per second unless I was working with a subject that I knew was going to be doing a lot of different movements, and I wanted to capture every single movement that they did. With birds in flight, 20 frames per second is more than adequate to get most wing positions, for example. So, and we'll see that coming up here in the photograph segment. On to the video, and the video is one of the things that's probably most attractive about this camera. It has 8K, 24p, and 30p 10-bit internal, and that to me is just a huge advantage with this camera, because what that does is that allows you to crop in post-production. And that cropping is crucial because with video particularly, it's very difficult to crop heavily because you don't have as much, let's say, 1080p you can't crop at all. 4K you might have a small amount of crop that you can do. But then with that 8K, you've got so much more cropping capability. And then you can always down-res it to 4K anyway when you're posting to YouTube or other sites. So that gives you so much flexibility. 4K is at 2460 and 120p, so you pick up now 4K slow motion with this camera. That's cropped, but with the 120p, it's a very small crop compared to the 24 and 60p. 1080p, we've got 24, 60, 120, and you get a really slow-mo option at 240. This camera also has the S-Cinetone profile, and that's my favorite profile for shooting video because it really isn't as difficult to color grade in post-production. And I think people that don't have a lot of experience with video will really appreciate what the S-Cinetone can provide you. It has, of course, we talked about this already, microphone, headphone for monitoring audio. It has the NP-FZ100 battery, which for me, in colder conditions, it lasted 1 day. At the end of the day, after shooting the geese, for example, I was down to 14% on the battery, but I had plenty of batteries with me. It was not an issue. I really only used one battery per day, and I charged it at nighttime. Okay, let's take a look at the photographs here. We're going to start out with the northern cardinal. I like to start out every review with some very what I call normal images that anybody might take. And we're going to get into better ones as we go here. But this is the northern cardinal. In a lot of ways, a typical shot that bird photographers, nature photographers would take in their own backyards, in their local parks and so forth. This, of course, was shot with the A1, with the FE 2 to 600 millimeter lens, f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/800th of a second at ISO 1600. And I think, everything's fine here. We've got good color rendition. We've got the reds are good. Of course, it's the winter time, so we've got a lot of browns and grays and so forth. But I think the image came out well. I think it was easy to work with in post-production. The noise was easy to remove. There was very little noise at this, at ISO 1600, very little noise, but it did a fine job. Okay, the next image. So here is what is called a snow goose. And this is from my trip to Middle Creek, Pennsylvania, where the snow geese migrate through every year. And here we have a very similar background, of course, because it's wintertime in Pennsylvania. And so we have the browns and the grays and so forth. This is, of course, a flight shot. How does this camera perform with flight shots? Okay, so don't burn me at the stake for what I'm about to say. As with most cameras, it has caveats. As with most fast action cameras, it still requires knowledge on the photographer's perspective, or from the photographer's perspective. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the A9, for example, right? A9, fast action, well-known fast action camera, 20 frames per second, very similar in most respects to this A1. I thought that frankly, the autofocus speed was the same. The A1 may have been slightly faster, although I don't know. You'd have to be hard-pressed to show me that in statistics. I think in the practical world, there was very little difference. I was very excited about the Bird IAF in this camera. And I have to say that I had mixed results with it, and many other photographers have as well, There were times that it would lock onto the eye, doing photography such as this right here. And there are often times it would lock onto the wing, it would lock onto the feet. So typical problems that any autofocus system has, any fast action autofocus system. A lot of people want you to believe that every single image is exactly the way you want it to be. And I think you have to be careful with that. I think, yes, probably 99% of the images were in focus. But what was in focus? Was it the wing? Was it the tail? Was the eye sharp, or was the wing sharp? So, that is something that's important. I think with the straight on shots like this one, it did pretty well, actually, locking it onto the head quite easily. But from the side, we're going to see issues, or I'm going to explain to you issues. I didn't put any of the bad shots in here just because I don't want them out there in flicker, but I will explain the shots where it didn't work. So we got the Sony Cuda 600 FE at 6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/5000th of a second at ISO 1250. You say, Matt, why did you have it at ISO 5000? Well, I mean, because I could, and I didn't want my shutter speed to interfere with, so many times if you're not careful, you can look at an image and you think it's camera blur, you think it's a subject blur, and the reality is it's not. It's the autofocus system. So I didn't want this to influence how it actually photographed with the AF. So I kept that shutter speed very, very high, up to where I would normally shoot songbirds at 1/5000 plus. Okay, so next image. We've got a flock shot here of the snow geese taking off at sunrise. And this is a silhouette shot. It did excellent here. Autofocus was good that early in the morning, which was impressive. Remember, that's one of the times, if you're familiar with camera systems, that's one of the times that an autofocus system can go wrong, is when you are at sunrise or sunset and you're trying to autofocus. It did a remarkable job autofocusing in low light. Just can't complain there. This shot was F9. I had my... well, that's interesting. It says F9, but it doesn't show 840 for the teleconverter. So maybe this was actually shot at F9. 600 millimeters, 1/3200th, ISO 8000. Very high ISO here. And I had to do a lot of cleanup on this in post. So would I recommend ISO 8000? No. Did it work for me here? Barely. But yes, it did work. So just bear in mind that I really don't recommend shooting anything over 6400 ISO. That's just my personal opinion. Okay, the next image, we have two flying snow geese here. One of them being the not so common, somewhat common, blue morph or dark morph on the left, and then the standard snow geese on the right, probably the greater snow geese. So in a shot like this, how did it do? Where did it lock? It locked onto the trailing bird here. I was able to lock onto that. I was using, for most of these images, I was using one of two modes. I was either using zone, or I was using the full frame, okay? Because, and what Sony calls wide, by the way. Because I'm doing that because that's a recommended way to use bird eye AF detect, and also a very strongly recommended way to use all Sony cameras. So I did not use lock-ons or anything like that. This is the way that I've had the best luck with Sony cameras. So this was f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/5000th of a second at ISO 1250. Very low noise here, easy to clean up. I don't even know if I cleaned this one up in post. I do see a dust spot that I missed, but that's okay. Okay, back to the backyard bird photography here. We've got a white-breasted nuthatch here, and bird eye AF was on, and it did a tremendous job, by the way, with backyard bird photography. So is that a big deal to me? No, because I know what I'm doing with backyard birds anyway, as far as using single point AF and so forth. But it does make it a little easier when you've got something like a white-breasted nuthatch, which tends to wander all over the wood and tree and everything else. So I think it did a good job here. Definitely would recommend it in this case. Okay, that's 1/800th of a second, 600 millimeters, ISO 1600. You'll see that as common. I'm usually around that 1,800 to 1,600 range. I think that's kind of a sweet spot for the camera, and I really liked it. Now, I've heard conflicting things about this camera and whether it has an anti-aliasing filter. Most of the people on the internet that I could find, or even on that were in the know, said that it does not have an AA filter. There were a few that said it has a very weak AA filter. So I wasn't sure. I may email. I think I might email professional services this week and see what they say about that. Okay, so this one, again, just a easy shot for the A1. Okay, next image, we have a snow goose coming in for a landing. And this is another shot that's pretty easy for the A1 because the bird's neck is sticking out so far like this. It's going to lock on to whatever's closest anyway, even if the bird IAF doesn't work. It's still going to lock on to that neck sticking out. And this is 200 to 600, f6.3, 600 millimeters, 1/5000th of a second at ISO 1250. Next image. Okay, so I pulled out here to, well, not really pulled out. I've essentially cropped in a little bit on this image of a bunch of snow geese sitting on the lake there at Middle Creek. And it just goes to show you, this was just an establishing shot just to show the numbers of geese that are present. Focus is kind of in the middle here, across the middle. And as you go back, it gets out of focus. And as you move forward, it gets out of focus. Okay, so f9, 840 millimeters with a teleconverter engaged, 1/3200th of a second, ISO 3200, well within the parameters of this camera. Okay, next one of my favorite shots from the trip. We have a snow goose here coming in. One of the kids there cracked me up. He was behind me, and he said to his mom, he goes, "They're coming in hot." I thought that was funny because that's a military jet kind of thing, when something's coming in hot, it's gonna fire basically. So he had started applying this to the snow geese, and I just got a kick out of that kid. But anyway, I digress on that. I like this one because it's straight on. Now, one of the things that's tricky when you're doing these snow geese is even if you're directly on sun angle, what ends up happening is if the sun's elevated slightly, as it is here, you're going to get that the head and neck are going to cast a shadow. But you know what? I actually kind of think that's cool because it looks like the perfect shape of the goose's head right there. So I actually like that. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But I really like this one because it showed the geese in the bottom of the frame, the big goose coming in, and really a big goose coming in here. One of my favorite shots from the trip. By the way, this was a vertical crop taken out of a horizontal. And with that 50 megapixel sensor, you can do things like this and still have 20 megapixels. So that's pretty cool. Next image. Okay, this is another favorite shot of mine from the Middle Creek trip. Got two snow geese coming in hot, right? Got two snow geese coming in here. And I really like the wing positions in this shot, and I like that both of them are pretty much on the same plane of focus, which is very hard to do with these. That's a real challenge. You got a forest behind them here, very natural habitat for them, And I just really enjoyed photographing these guys. I mean, it was just such an amazing experience. This was actually my first time, believe it or not, doing snow geese. I went one other time, and weather destroyed it. I couldn't even get in. I needed a 4-wheel drive. I didn't have one at the time, and I just never went back. But really enjoyed this. f6.3, 600 millimeters, no teleextender, 1/5000th of a second, ISO 1000. Next image. Here's one that I didn't like initially, and now I really like it. But it shows how selectively you can focus with that A1 or really any of the Sony cameras using the zone focusing here. Notice how it just picked out the center only to focus on rather than what's closest to me, right? So it picked out this bird and tracked him. And what I like about it is it feels like I actually labeled this inside the flock. It feels like I'm actually in there a little bit flying with them. I know it sounds kind of goofy, but it kind of feels that way. It gives the viewer that feeling. So I really ended up liking this shot. f6.3, 600 millimeters, ISO 1250, 1/5000th of a second. Next image. There were also Canada geese here at Middle Creek. And here we have some pre-mating ritual going on. And what will happen is that the gander will actually start to, I don't know any better way to say this, flirt or harass in this case, the female. And what's happening is he comes up behind her, bites her on the neck, and chases her all over the pond and so forth. And this was a pond that was near Middle Creek Lake. It's really part of Middle Creek. But I just thought that was kind of an interesting shot here. He's got his tongue sticking out like a dope. And just took it. So we got the 1.4x teleconverter here, 840 millimeters, f9, 1/4000th of a second, ISO 2500 here. Did have to clean this up a bit. One of the things you have to be careful of with ISO, like ISO, it can be clean at 2500, or it can be pretty grainy, right? At 2500. It just depends on the shadows mostly. Like here we have a lot of shadows in the background. The pond itself is a shadowy pond. And so that was all showing some pretty good noise there. I wouldn't have gotten that same amount of noise with my A9, but I wouldn't have been able to crop like I did here and get this higher megapixel crop. And so it's always this trade-off with these high megapixel cameras. There's always a trade-off there. All right, next image. All right, I like this image. Another Canada goose image. And what happened here was at sunrise, I was actually in a field near the main lake. And here comes these honkers. I call them honkers for short, but the Canada geese coming in. And this one lone one was flying across, and you actually have a little bit of a optical illusion going on here. So I took a silhouette of this guy, and actually he's flying away from me, but the silhouette could go either way. It could look like he's flying toward me or away from me. Isn't that weird? It's kind of an optical illusion, but I really like the way you have such interesting gradients here going on. You've got kind of this purplish sky going into this kind of muddy yellowish color, and then down into the really bold golden color of the sunrise. So I really, really like this shot, and kind of proud of it. f9, 1.4x teleconverter, 840 millimeters, 1/2500th of a second, ISO 3200. Okay, now here's an example. In this next image, here's a goose up close. Now, the shots previous to this were locked onto his wing. And why? Because every time that wing comes down like that, the camera sees it as closer to you than the bird. And so it tries to lock onto that very high contrasty wing. And that's not always desirable depending on how close the bird is and so forth. If you have a very close bird, as in this case, You don't want it locking onto that wing, because then the eye might be out of focus. If it's farther away, you'll have more depth of field. But there were a lot of images like that, and I don't want to say, I don't know what percentage I would give it, but there were images where the wing was locked onto and the eye was out of focus, and the bill. So it goes to show you that even with a camera that's high end like this, the eye autofocus doesn't always work. Here it did, and I was rewarded. So the IAF comes in handy. Even if it doesn't work all the time, it's still always there trying to work, and if it can pull it off, it'll do it. And we're not talking, I mean, snow geese fly fairly fast, but we're not talking, duck speed here. I mean, they're certainly nowhere near a duck in speed. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. Just because you buy a $6,000 camera doesn't mean that it's going to work every single time you push the shutter release. And I think people get that idea that they're just I'm going to buy this $6,500 camera and it's going to solve all my problems. Look, you still got to get there. You still got to have creativity. You still got to know where the birds are. You still got to know the sun position, the wind. The wind needs to be at your back. The sun needs to be at your back, as it is here. And he's flying right straight across me. And really, the IAF needs to work properly, in my opinion. Otherwise, you have a much lower percentage of shots that you're going to get. So the A9 might, because the A9 doesn't have IAF for birds. The A9 II does, I believe, but the A9 doesn't. So when you're shooting the A9, you might lock onto that wing too often. So one of the things you can do is, if you're really good, you can either move the zone forward a little bit, so you're getting more. If you got birds coming from left to right, you can move that zone over to the right so it locks onto the neck and head more. But here's the problem with that. We don't always know where the bird's coming from. We don't know if it's coming from the right side or the left side, and so you're always fighting that battle, and that's why that bird IAF is so important to what we're doing. Anyway, this guy is at 15000, 1250, same thing, ISO 1250, same settings. Okay, next shot here, bird IAF does work. Here it is on a static shot, and just a goose sticking its head up here. It's very difficult to get, single shots of geese and so forth. So now, really, if I wanted to do this shot properly and I wasn't being lazy, I would have set the A1 up to have a custom hold to where I can hold the button in, and then it would reset. It would go to auto ISO, and then it would reset my shutter speed to 1.500 or 1.640 or something like that. That way I could get the best ISO for this shot. But I just left it in this case at ISO 1600 and shot at 1/5000th of a second. So it's all good. It's all good. Okay, the next image, another one of my favorite goose landings here. Sun angle's good. Wind angle was good. Nice side shot here of a goose landing, and I love the wing position. I love the way that they stick their head straight down, and they get so serious about how they're going to land, and they have awesome eyesight. They can see eagles flying overhead way up in there, and they'll take off flying if they see them, because an eagle will take out one of these guys. I've also seen them take out ducks. So they're not off the menu. They are on the menu. This one we've got 1/4000th of a second at ISO 2000. Now this one is a teleconverter shot at 840 millimeters f9. So yes, it can lock on with the teleconverter. Very cool. So the next image, this was an image that's taken at the top of a hill, and I kind of liked it because it's a section of the flock, and they're just up on that ridge, and it gives that nice separation with the field in the foreground, then the birds, and then the blue sky behind them. And I just left it at 1/4000th of a second for that shot. Okay, now this is an image I think we'll end it here. This is an image that shows basically a full frame image. I did crop it to an 8x10 here, but the wings are full frame vertical. So this is a full frame, basically, let's just call it a 40. I think it ended up being like a 42 megapixel image in the 8x10 format. But this is an example of where the autofocus system worked perfectly, because the neck is closer to me than the wings. So even if the IAF didn't work, the chances of it working are better. Now, in this case, I do think the IAF kicked in. And you could see it. You could see it on the screen, and you could see it. It'll go to the eye, and it'll hold on to it, and then it'll flip away, and then it'll go to the wing, and it'll go back to the eye. That's, you can kind of change that a little bit in the settings by making it not as responsive. You can make the autofocus not as responsive, which will help possibly in that scenario. Again, I only had this A1 for a week, actually about 2 weeks. And so I didn't have a year to work with it or anything, but this is just my initial reaction. And this is coming from a guy that shoots with the A9 regularly. So I'm very familiar with what high-speed cameras can do. This was also with a teleconverter, f9, 1/4 thousandths of a second, ISO 2000. Great shot. I love it. I could sit there all day long that weekend on that Saturday. I could sit there all day long, and not all day long, but for 2 hours, I could make shots like this with the A1 just continuously. And I remember, back, let's see, when I had the 7D Mark II, the Canon 7D Mark II, I could have never got this many shots in focus in a day. There's just no way. I mean, literally, I ended up with, I guess I should have explained that to start with. I ended up with close to 10,000 images that I took while I was at Middle Creek. I've called that down to 7,200 or something like that. But still, just shot after shot after shot in focus. It really helps you realize the vision that you've always had, and you couldn't do it. So I wanted to conclude, in conclusion, really, who is this camera for? It's $6,500. Okay, maybe, $6,200 on sale or something like that. Who is this camera for? This camera is for the guy that's not afraid, first of all, to spend $6,500. But beyond that, who is it for? It's for me. It's for my type. It's for the guy that does a lot of sports. Even more than sports, though, it's really for, I think, the nature photographer. I think this camera can check off all the boxes. It can handle regular old wildlife, deer, elk, bears. It can handle eagles flying, these snow geese, backyard birds. It can handle scenics. It can handle just about anything you throw at it, and it's happy, right? You can adjust. It's very adjustable. You can if you get tired of 30 frames per second, you can take it back to like 15 frames per, or whatever it is. I think it's 15. Take it back to like 15 frames per second, which is more than adequate for a lot of things. You can keep it at 20. You can change the RAW so you don't have a 50 megapixel RAW if you don't need it. There's just so many options here, so many video options. I took a little handheld videos and stabilized them in post. Maybe I'll throw one of those up here. Nothing serious, but just to give you an idea. So many options available with this camera that it's a win for anybody, but particularly for nature photographers. Will I be running out and buying this? Absolutely not. I don't have that kind of budget. I am happy with my A9. It does what I need to do for now. For my serious waterfall images and things like that, the A7R III that I have at 42 megapixels is more than enough for what I needed to do. Who doesn't need this? Okay, let's talk about that. If you are a landscape photographer, if you are someone that prides themselves on creating these amazing still lifes, or anything along those lines, any super artistic endeavors and things, you don't need this camera. You do not need this camera. I would recommend the A7R4 or A7R5. You just don't need it. If you're a serious videographer, I would recommend like the FX3 or the A7S series, or even the FX30, which is a newer affordable video camera. This is the camera that is for the guy that he's tired of carrying around two bodies. He wants to go to one body. He doesn't want to deal with, oh, I wished I had this feature right now, because he's got all the features. And it's for the guy that just, has expendable income. I mean, at $6,500, let's be honest, you could buy quite a lot of stuff for that, and frankly, the used market is so much more appealing to me as a money savings venture. But again, I'm not trying to dissuade you from buying this if this camera does it all, guys. I mean, it's amazing. So I kind of leave it with that. I hope you enjoyed this small review here. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. It helps me greatly in getting monetized and so forth. And as always, thanks for watching. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye.